Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most mysterious and forbidden places, a world where 3,000 women lived together, but only one man was allowed to enter their bedrooms. What if I told you that behind the golden walls of imperial palaces, there existed bedroom rules so strange, so shocking, that they would make your modern dating problems seem like child's play? Rules where the colour of your silk sheets could mean the difference between life and death, where your sleeping position wasn't just about comfort, but about survival itself. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the Imperial Harem, a place where power, passion, and paranoia created the most bizarre bedroom culture in human history. And trust me, what you're about to discover will completely change how you think about palace life forever. Before we slip into this hidden world together, I'd love it if you could show some love by hitting that subscribe button. It really helps me bring you more of these fascinating stories, and if you're already feeling intrigued, go ahead and give this video a like. I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching this from tonight? Are you cozy in bed, or maybe listening while you wind down? Drop a comment and let me know. I always love hearing from you. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step through the forbidden doors of the Imperial Harem together. Picture this. It's the year 1420, deep within the forbidden city of Beijing. The morning sun barely pierces through the ornate wooden screens, casting dancing shadows across silk tapestries that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. But this isn't just any palace room. This is part of the inner court, where the emperor's harem lived in what historians call golden captivity. Now, when most people hear the word harem, they immediately think of Hollywood movies, the ones with flowing curtains, exotic music, and women lounging around eating grapes. But the reality was far more complex, far more structured, and honestly, far more fascinating than any movie could ever capture. The Imperial Harem wasn't just a collection of bedrooms, it was an entire universe with its own laws, its own economy, and its own deadly politics. Think of it as the world's most exclusive gated community, except once you moved in, you could never, ever leave. And the membership fee? Your entire life. In the Chinese imperial system, the harem could house anywhere from several hundred to over 3,000 women. That's not a typo, 3,000. To put that in perspective, that's larger than many American high schools. Now imagine all those women competing for the attention of just one man. The tension, the alliances, the betrayals. It was like a reality TV show, except the stakes weren't just embarrassment or elimination. They were life and death. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. These weren't just random women plucked from the streets. The harem was a carefully constructed hierarchy, almost like a corporate structure, but with much prettier uniforms and infinitely deadlier office politics. At the top, you had the Empress. Think of her as the CEO of this feminine empire. Below her were the various ranks of consorts, each with specific titles, specific privileges, and most importantly for our story tonight, specific bedroom rules. The selection process alone was extraordinary. Every 3 years, officials would travel across the empire, searching for girls between the ages of 13 and 17. They weren't just looking for beauty, though that certainly didn't hurt. They needed girls who could read, who showed intelligence, who had the right family connections. It was like a nationwide talent search, except the prize was a lifetime behind golden bars. Once selected, These young women underwent what can only be described as finishing school from another planet. They learned multiple languages, mastered various arts, studied poetry and music, and most crucially, they learned the intricate social codes that would govern every aspect of their lives, especially their most intimate moments. And this is where our story gets really interesting. You see, in the outside world, a bedroom is just a bedroom. It's where you sleep, where you relax, where you keep your clothes in a pile on that one chair we all have. But in the harem, a bedroom wasn't just a room. It was a stage, a battlefield, and a sanctuary all rolled into one. The Ottoman Empire had a similar system, and their harem in the Topkapi Palace housed up to 400 women at its peak. The Mughal emperors in India, they had their own version too. This wasn't just a Chinese thing. It was a global phenomenon among absolute monarchs. Each culture added its own twist to the bedroom rules, creating a fascinating tapestry of human behavior under extreme circumstances. What strikes me most about studying these harems is how resourceful these women were. Stripped of almost every freedom we take for granted, they created entire worlds within worlds. They developed languages that their guards couldn't understand, economic systems that operated in secret, and yes, bedroom protocols that would have made a Swiss diplomat impressed with their complexity. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the harem system was how it revealed fundamental truths about human nature. When you put hundreds or thousands of intelligent, ambitious women in close quarters with limited opportunity or advancement, you get a masterclass in psychology, politics, and survival. The bedroom rules we'll explore weren't just arbitrary restrictions. They were the result of centuries of trial and error, of tragedy and triumph, of women learning to navigate an impossible system. The Imperial Harem was a world where a single glance could be interpreted as treason, where friendship was a luxury few could afford, and where the person sharing your bed might be the very person reporting your secrets to the authorities. It was a place where love was dangerous, where trust was deadly, and where the most ordinary human interactions became extraordinary acts of courage. So as we begin this journey together, remember that we're not just learning about strange rules from a distant past. We're exploring what happens when power becomes absolute, when women are reduced to possessions, and when the most basic human needs for love, for freedom, for dignity must be pursued in secret. The bedroom rules we'll discover weren't just about protocol. They were about survival, resistance, and the indomitable human spirit. Are you ready to discover secrets that have been hidden for centuries? Because what we're about to uncover in the world of imperial bedroom protocols will completely change how you think about power, control, and human resilience. And speaking of colours and their deadly meanings, wait until you hear about the colour-coded bedroom system that determined life and death with nothing more than a silk scarf. Red silk meant life or death, and the women knew exactly what it meant when they saw it draped across their doorway at dawn. You might think I'm being dramatic, but I'm about to share something that will completely change how you view the power of colour. In the Imperial Harem, colours weren't just about fashion or personal preference. They were a complex communication system that could elevate a woman to empress or send her to an early grave. Let me paint you a picture of what mornings looked like in the Forbidden City. Imagine waking up in a room filled with the softest silk, surrounded by furniture that's worth more than entire villages. Sounds like paradise, right? But then you notice the colour of the fabric hanging outside your door has changed overnight. Your heart starts racing, because you know that this simple change in colour could mean everything. In the Chinese imperial system, Yellow was the emperor's exclusive color, not just any yellow. We're talking about a very specific shade called Imperial Yellow that was so closely guarded. Wearing it without permission was considered treason punishable by death. And I'm not exaggerating here. Historical records from the Ming Dynasty show multiple instances of concubines being executed simply for wearing the wrong shade of yellow by mistake. But here's where it gets really interesting. The harem developed an entire rainbow of meaning around colours. Red silk hanging outside your chamber meant the emperor had selected you for that evening. Congratulations. You just won the deadliest lottery in history. Purple indicated you were rising in favour, while white, well, white was the colour of mourning, and seeing it meant either you had fallen from grace or someone close to you had met an unfortunate end. The Ottoman Empire had their own version of this colour-coded madness. In the Topkapi Palace, the Sultan's harem used different coloured scarves and veils to communicate status and intentions. A concubine wearing green indicated she was favoured and untouchable. Mess with her, and you'd answer to the Sultan himself. Blue meant she was available for political alliances through arranged friendships. And black? Black meant she was in mourning, and therefore off limits to all social interactions. Now, you might be wondering, how did these women keep track of all these rules? Well, that's where the genius of female survival instincts comes in. These weren't just arbitrary fashion choices, they were a survival manual written in thread and fabric. Let me tell you about Consort Li, a woman whose story was recorded in the palace archives during the Qing dynasty. She was known for her incredible ability to read the colour codes, not just of her own clothes, but of everyone around her. According to historical accounts, she could walk into a room and immediately know who was rising, who was falling, and who was in immediate danger, all just by observing the subtle colour variations in their clothing and room decorations. One morning, Consort Li noticed that all the high-ranking concubines had mysteriously switched to wearing deep blue, a colour that typically indicated preparation for a major court event. But here's the twist. No official announcement had been made. Using her colour-reading skills, she deduced that the emperor was about to make a major decision about succession, and the smart women were already positioning themselves accordingly. She quickly changed her own attire to match, and sure enough, 3 days later, the emperor announced the selection of a new heir. Those who had read the signs correctly were rewarded with higher positions. But the psychological impact of this system was profound. Imagine living in a world where you wake up every morning and the first thing you have to do is decode whether you're going to live or die based on the colour of fabric outside your door. It's like a daily Russian roulette, except instead of bullets, you're dealing with silk scarves. The Mughal Empire took this concept even further. Emperor Akbar's harem in the 16th century used an incredibly sophisticated colour system, where not just the primary colour mattered, but the specific combinations and patterns. A red dress with gold embroidery meant something completely different from a red dress with silver threads. The women became walking encyclopedias of colour symbolism. What fascinates me most is how these women turned this oppressive system into a form of covert communication. They couldn't speak freely, couldn't write letters without censorship, but they could speak through their clothing choices. A slight change in the shade of your headscarf could communicate to your allies that you had information. A particular pattern of coloured ribbons could warn others of impending danger. Historical records from the Joseon dynasty in Korea show that palace women developed what they called the silent language, a complex system where different coloured threads in their embroidery could communicate entire messages. They would spend hours working on seemingly decorative pieces that were actually coded communications about palace politics. warnings about dangerous officials, or plans for protection. The irony is that the very system designed to control these women became their tool for resistance. The authorities thought they were maintaining order through color-coded restrictions, but the women were using these same colors to build networks, share information, and protect each other. And here's something that might surprise you. This color psychology wasn't just superstition. Modern psychological research has shown that colors genuinely affect our mood and behavior. Red does increase heart rate and can signal danger. Purple has historically been associated with royalty and power. These ancient systems were tapping into something deeply embedded in human psychology. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the color-coded bedroom system was how it affected the women's sense of identity. When your worth is literally reflected in the colors you're allowed to wear, when your survival depends on correctly interpreting fabric choices, you start to lose touch with who you are beyond these external markers. I found a particularly moving account in the memoirs of a palace servant from the Ottoman court. She wrote about watching young women arrive at the harem, full of dreams and personality, only to see them gradually disappear into the color-coded roles assigned to them. They stopped being women, she wrote, and became walking symbols of imperial will. Yet even in this dehumanizing system, there were moments of touching humanity. Records show that women would sometimes risk punishment to comfort a friend who had been assigned the dreaded white mourning colors. They would sneak small touches of brighter colors into their accessories, a hidden red thread in their undergarments, a tiny purple bead sewn into their sleeve, small acts of rebellion that declared their humanity in a system designed to erase it. The most powerful example I've found comes from the late Qing dynasty, when the entire color system began to break down as the empire crumbled. Women started deliberately mixing forbidden color combinations, creating their own new meanings. It was a quiet revolution, fought with nothing more than needle and thread, but it represented something profound, the refusal to let external systems define their worth. As we think about these color-coded bedroom rules, we're really looking at a microcosm of how power operates. When you control something as basic as what colors someone can wear, you're not just controlling their appearance, you're controlling their psychology, their relationships, their very sense of self. But these women found ways to resist, to communicate, to maintain their humanity even within the most restrictive systems. Their stories remind us that the human spirit is remarkably adaptable, and that even in the most oppressive circumstances, people find ways to connect, to protect each other, and to maintain their dignity. Now, speaking of maintaining dignity in impossible circumstances, you won't believe what happened every single night at the stroke of midnight in these palaces. What I'm about to tell you about the midnight inspection rituals will make you appreciate your privacy in ways you never imagined possible. Every night at exactly midnight, something happened in the harem that would horrify modern women, and it wasn't what you think. Picture this. You're fast asleep in your silk-draped bed, dreaming perhaps of the life you left behind, when suddenly you hear the soft shuffle of footsteps outside your door. Your heart jumps because you know what's coming, the midnight inspection. And no, this wasn't about checking if you'd brushed your teeth or said your prayers. Let me take you inside one of these inspections, because what I'm about to describe will make you want to hug your privacy settings a little tighter tonight. In the Chinese imperial system, every single night without exception, teams of eunuchs would conduct what they called the evening verification. Starting at the stroke of midnight, they would move through the harem quarters like ghosts, checking every single woman, every single room, every single bed, and I mean everything. The eunuchs, men who'd been castrated specifically to serve in the harem because they posed no threat to the emperor's exclusive access, carried detailed logs that would make a modern auditor weep with joy. They recorded who was sleeping where, with whom, in what position, and even what they were wearing to bed. Yes, you heard that right. Your pajama choices were a matter of state security. But here's where it gets really invasive. The eunuchs didn't just peek through doorways. They had the authority to wake any woman at any time to verify her identity, check her health, and ensure she wasn't hiding anything, or anyone, in her chambers. Historical records from the Ming dynasty show that these inspections could last anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, depending on the size of the harem and the paranoia level of the current emperor. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly were they looking for? Well, the official reason was security. The emperors lived in constant fear of assassination, rebellion, or worse, someone challenging their exclusive claim to these women. But the real reason was control. Pure, psychological control. Let me share a story that perfectly illustrates just how thorough these inspections were. In 1598, during the reign of Emperor Wanli, a young concubine named Mei was discovered with a small mirror hidden under her mattress. Sounds harmless, right? Wrong. That mirror was considered contraband because it wasn't regulation palace property. It was something from her previous life. The punishment? She was sent to the Cold Palace, essentially solitary confinement, for 3 months, all because of a mirror. The Ottoman Empire had their own version of this nightmare. In the Topkapi Palace, the Valid Sultan, the emperor's mother, employed a network of female inspectors called Khalfa, who had even more access than the Chinese eunuchs. These women could enter any room at any time, and their inspections were so thorough that historical accounts described them checking inside pillows, examining jewelry for hidden compartments, and even testing food for poison. But here's what's truly disturbing. These inspections created a culture of mutual surveillance. The women knew they were being watched, so they started watching each other. Palace records show that informants among the concubines themselves became the most effective tool for these midnight checks. Imagine trying to sleep, knowing that your roommate might be taking mental notes about your breathing patterns to report the next morning. The psychological impact was devastating. Dr. Sarah Chen, a historian who specialized in Imperial Chinese court life, discovered diary entries from a Qing dynasty concubine that reveal the mental toll of these inspections. The woman wrote, "I have forgotten how to sleep peacefully. Even in dreams, I feel eyes upon me, counting my breaths, measuring my movements." And the eunuchs themselves? They lived in their own special kind of hell. Historical accounts describe how they were trained from childhood to be emotionally detached, to see the women not as human beings but as imperial property to be catalogued and maintained. Some records suggest that the most successful inspectors were those who had completely suppressed their capacity for empathy. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. In the Forbidden City during the Qing dynasty, with nearly 3,000 women in the harem, the inspection teams needed to be incredibly organized. They developed a rotation system where different groups of eunuchs would cover different sections of the palace, with detailed maps showing optimal routes and timing schedules that would make Amazon delivery drivers jealous. But here's where human ingenuity shines through the darkness. The women developed countermeasures that were absolutely brilliant. They created sleeping arrangements that looked natural but were actually strategic. positioning themselves so that the most vulnerable women were protected by those who were more favored. They developed silent communication systems using hand signals that could convey warnings about approaching inspectors. One of the most clever adaptations I discovered was the breathing circle system used in the Korean Joseon dynasty. Groups of women would synchronize their breathing patterns so that inspectors couldn't tell who was truly asleep and who was pretending. This created a form of collective protection. If one woman was having trouble sleeping due to stress or illness, the others would cover for her. The most heartbreaking aspect of these inspections was how they affected the women's relationships with each other. Historical accounts describe how friendships became dangerous because any sign of unusual closeness between women would be reported and investigated. The inspectors were specifically trained to look for signs of inappropriate emotional attachments between the concubines. There's a particularly moving account from the memoirs of a palace servant who worked during the late Ottoman period. She described watching young women arrive at the harem and gradually lose their ability to form genuine connections with others. They learned to sleep with their hearts closed, she wrote, because opening them had become too dangerous. The equipment used for these inspections was surprisingly sophisticated. Palace inventories show that the eunuchs carried specially designed lanterns that could provide light without creating shadows where someone might hide. They had mirrors on long handles to check under beds and behind furniture. They even had measuring tools to ensure that beds were positioned at regulation distances from walls, because apparently, even furniture placement was a security concern. And the reports they filed? They were works of bureaucratic art. Each inspection generated detailed documentation that included diagrams of room layouts, lists of personal belongings, descriptions of sleeping positions, and even notes about the women's emotional states. These reports were filed in duplicate, with copies going to different departments to prevent any single person from having complete information. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was how normalized this became. Women who had been in the harem for years would actually help the inspectors, pointing out new arrivals or unusual behaviors. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. In a system where everyone was watching everyone else, cooperation became a form of self-preservation. The psychological research on surveillance and its effects on human behavior shows that constant observation changes people at a fundamental level. When you know you're being watched, you start to watch yourself, to monitor your own thoughts and behaviors. The women in these harems essentially became their own prison guards. Yet even in this oppressive system, there were moments of quiet rebellion. Palace records show instances of women deliberately leaving small violations for the inspectors to find. A pillow slightly out of place, a piece of jewelry in the wrong box, as a way of maintaining some sense of agency in their lives. It was like saying, "Yes, you can watch me, but I still exist as a person with my own will." The most remarkable discovery I made in researching these inspections was how the women developed what we might call invisible resistance. They found ways to maintain their humanity and dignity that were completely undetectable to their watchers. They created internal emotional lives that no inspection could penetrate, formed spiritual practices that required no external materials, and developed mental exercises that help them retain their sense of self. As we think about these midnight inspections, we're really looking at the extreme end of surveillance culture. These women lived in a world where privacy was not just absent, it was actively criminalized. Every breath, every movement, every thought had to be calculated against the possibility of observation and judgment. But their stories also show us something powerful about human resilience. Even under the most intrusive surveillance, people find ways to maintain their dignity, to protect each other, and to resist in small but meaningful ways. The women of the Imperial Harem teaches us that the human spirit is remarkably adaptable, but also remarkably persistent in its desire for freedom. Now, if you think the midnight inspections were invasive, wait until you hear about the secret communication systems these women developed right under the noses of their guards. What I'm about to reveal will show you that even in the most controlled environment imaginable, human creativity finds a way to flourish. They developed an entire language using only hand gestures and fabric arrangements, and it saved lives. What I'm about to share with you is perhaps one of the most ingenious examples of human creativity under pressure. When you can't speak freely, when every word is monitored, when even your facial expressions are being analyzed for signs of rebellion, what do? You create a completely new way to communicate that's hiding in plain sight. The women of the Imperial Harem didn't just develop one secret language, they created an entire ecosystem of covert communication that was so sophisticated it would make modern cryptographers jealous. And the most beautiful part? They did it using things that were already part of their daily lives. Let me start with what historians call the language of fans. Now, you might think a fan is just for keeping cool, but in the hands of a harem woman, it became a sophisticated messaging system. A fan held close to the heart meant I love you. A fan resting on the right cheek meant yes, while the left cheek meant no. But here's where it gets really intricate. The speed of the fan movement, the number of times it was opened and closed, even which fingers were used to hold it. All of these conveyed different meanings. During the Qing dynasty, palace records show that the fan language became so complex that new arrivals to the harem had to undergo months of training just to understand basic conversations. There's a fascinating account from 1789 where a young concubine named Jade accidentally used the wrong fan gesture during a formal dinner and inadvertently told the Empress Dowager that she was planning to poison her. The poor girl spent 3 days in detention while the misunderstanding was sorted out, but the fan language was just the beginning. The women also developed what they called the silk conversations, different ways of arranging silk scarves, ribbons, and even the folds in their clothing could convey entire messages. A scarf draped over the left shoulder with a specific knot meant danger approaching. A particular way of folding a sleeve indicated, "Meet me tonight." The complexity was staggering. Historical accounts describe over 200 different fabric arrangements, each with precise meanings. The Ottoman harem took this concept even further. Turkish palace records from the 16th century describe a system called the garden language, where women would arrange flowers and plants in their rooms to communicate. A red tulip placed next to a white rose meant one thing, while the same flowers in reverse order meant something completely different. The women became master gardeners out of necessity, creating beautiful arrangements that were actually encoded messages. What's truly remarkable is how these languages evolved to include emergency protocols. The Korean Joseon Dynasty palace archives contain detailed descriptions of crisis signals that could be communicated instantly across the entire harem, a specific pattern of clapping hands, a particular way of adjusting hair ornaments, or even the order in which women entered and left rooms. All of these could convey urgent warnings about inspections, punishments, or political changes. Let me tell you about Lady Chen, a concubine during the Ming dynasty, whose story was preserved in the private memoirs of a palace eunuch. Lady Chen was known for her incredible mastery of these silent languages. According to the account, she once used a combination of fan gestures, fabric arrangements, and flower positioning to coordinate the protection of a young concubine who had accidentally violated palace protocol. The entire operation, involving over 30 women, was conducted in complete silence during a formal court ceremony, right under the noses of the guards. The psychological genius of these systems was that they looked completely natural. A woman arranging flowers in her room, adjusting her clothing, or using a fan to cool herself. These were all normal, expected behaviors. The guards and eunuchs saw these activities happening hundreds of times a day and became blind to their true significance. But developing these languages required incredible collective intelligence. The women had to agree on meanings, teach newcomers, and constantly update the codes to prevent discovery. Historical records show that they held secret language councils where senior concubines would introduce new gestures or modify existing ones. These meetings were disguised as embroidery circles or tea gatherings. The most sophisticated version I've encountered was in the Mughal court of Emperor Akbar. The women there developed what they called the mirror language, i.e., using the reflective surfaces of jewellery, water bowls, and polished metal objects. They could send messages across rooms and even between different buildings. The angle of reflection, the duration of the flash, and the pattern of movements all conveyed specific meanings. It was like an ancient version of Morse code, but using light instead of sound. And here's something that will blow your mind. They even developed scent languages. Different perfumes, incense, and flower oils were used to convey messages. A particular fragrance worn by a woman could indicate her mood, her availability for alliance, or even warn others of danger. The palace records from the Safavid court in Persia describe over 50 different scent combinations, each with specific meanings understood throughout the harem. The teaching methods for these languages were equally ingenious. Since formal instruction was impossible, the women used storytelling, songs, and even dance to encode the lessons. A particular folk tale told during evening gatherings might actually be a tutorial on new hand signals. A traditional dance could be a lesson in fabric arrangement codes. The culture of the harem became a living textbook of covert communication. One of the most touching examples comes from the late Ottoman period. A woman named Safiye, who'd been in the harem for over 20 years, created what she called the memory quilts. These were beautiful textile works that appeared to be decorative, but were actually comprehensive guides to the secret languages. Each pattern, each color combination, each stitch told part of the story of how to communicate without words. When she died, her quilt became a treasured training manual for new arrivals. The emotional impact of these languages cannot be overstated. In a world where expressing your true thoughts could mean death, these women found ways to share their fears, hopes, and dreams with each other. They could offer comfort to someone who was suffering, warn a friend about approaching danger, or simply say, "I see you, I understand you, you are not alone." But perhaps the most remarkable aspect was how these languages became tools of resistance. The women used them to coordinate small acts of defiance, to share information about palace politics, and to maintain networks of mutual support. They were fighting back against a system designed to isolate them, using nothing more than creative communication. The guards and officials weren't completely oblivious to these activities. Palace records show periodic communication purges where certain gestures or arrangements were banned after being discovered, but the women always adapted, always found new ways to connect. It was like a constant game of cat and mouse, played with fans and flowers instead of weapons. Modern linguists who have studied these systems are amazed by their complexity and durability. Dr. Maria Rodriguez, who wrote extensively about palace communication systems, noted that these languages showed characteristics of natural languages. They had grammar, syntax, and even regional dialects. Different parts of the same palace might develop slight variations in their gesture languages. What strikes me most about these secret languages is how they reveal the fundamental human need for connection and communication. Even in the most oppressive circumstances, people will find ways to reach out to each other, to share their humanity, to maintain the bonds that make us human. The women of the Imperial Harem created something beautiful and powerful out of their oppression. They turned their prison into a place of secret solidarity, their silence into a form of resistance, their isolation into a network of support. They showed us that even when your words are stolen, your voice can still be heard. These languages also served a practical purpose in helping women navigate the dangerous politics of harem life. Through subtle communications, they could share information about who was rising or falling in favor, which eunuchs were trustworthy, and what the emperor's mood might be on any given day. Knowledge was power, and these communication systems were how that power was shared. The legacy of these secret languages extends far beyond the palace walls. They represent a powerful example of how marginalized groups throughout history have found ways to resist oppression through creative communication, from the coded songs of enslaved people to the secret hand signals of underground resistance movements. The human spirit consistently finds ways to speak truth to power. Now, as ingenious as these communication systems were, they were just one part of a much larger survival strategy. Because once you could talk to each other safely, the next challenge was navigating the physical environment itself. And speaking of the physical environment, wait until you discover how even the most beautiful and luxurious objects in these bedrooms could become instruments of terror. That beautiful silk bed wasn't just furniture, it was a potential death trap. When you look at historical paintings of Imperial Harem bedrooms, you see scenes of breathtaking luxury, ornate carved wooden beds draped in the finest silk, jewelry boxes inlaid with precious stones, mirrors framed in gold, delicate porcelain vases filled with exotic flowers. It looks like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But what if I told you that almost every single beautiful object in these rooms had the potential to become an instrument of terror? The furniture in a harem bedroom wasn't just about comfort or aesthetics. It was about survival, power, and sometimes elimination. Every piece had hidden meanings, secret compartments, and in some cases, deadly surprises that could change a woman's fate in an instant. Let me start with the beds themselves, because this is where the story gets really dark. In the Chinese imperial system, beds weren't just places to sleep, they were stages where life and death dramas played out nightly. The frame of a harem bed was often hollow, creating space for hidden compartments that could conceal everything from love letters to poison antidotes. But here's the truly chilling part. Those same compartments could also hide weapons, surveillance devices, or even worse, evidence that could be planted to frame someone for treason. During the Ming Dynasty, there's a documented case from 1643 where a concubine named Lotus was found dead in her bed, apparently from natural causes. But when investigators examined her ornate sleeping platform, they discovered a tiny needle mechanism hidden in the carved dragon that decorated the headboard. The needle had been coated with a slow-acting poison that would have caused symptoms resembling a heart attack. The beautiful dragon that had watched over her sleep had literally been turned into her executioner. The Ottoman Empire took bedroom furniture dangers to an entirely different level. In the Topkapi Palace, many of the ornate wooden chests used for storing clothing and personal items were equipped with false bottoms and secret locks. But here's where it gets really sinister. Some of these chests contained spring-loaded mechanisms that could crush fingers or hands if opened incorrectly. It was a brutal way to discourage women from examining each other's belongings too closely. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating pieces of furniture were the mirrors. In Western culture, we think of mirrors as simple, reflective surfaces, but in the harem, they were instruments of surveillance and psychological warfare. Many mirrors were actually two-way glass, allowing observers to watch the women's most private moments. Historical accounts from the Safavid court in Persia describe mirrors that could be remotely adjusted to reflect light in specific patterns, a form of optical communication that could send signals to confederates in other parts of the palace. Let me tell you about the jewellery boxes, because these might be the most diabolical furniture pieces of all. These weren't just storage containers, they were sophisticated psychological weapons. A jewellery box given to a favoured concubine might play a beautiful melody when opened, but that same melody could be a coded message to other women about the recipient's new status. More terrifyingly, some boxes were designed to play different melodies depending on who opened them, a form of musical identity verification that could expose spies or imposters. The Mughal court had jewellery boxes that went even further. Historical records describe boxes with compartments that could only be opened by pressing a specific sequence of hidden buttons. Get the sequence wrong, and the box would emit a loud alarm that would bring guards running. But get it right, and you might find messages, money, or even small weapons hidden inside. These boxes turned every woman into a potential locksmith, constantly trying to decode the secrets of their own possessions. Seating furniture in the harem was equally treacherous. The beautiful silk cushions and ornate chairs weren't just about comfort, they were about hierarchy and control. In the Chinese imperial system, the height of your seat, the quality of your cushions, and even the angle at which your chair faced the door all communicated your status within the harem. But here's the twist. These arrangements could change overnight without warning. A woman might wake up to find her chair had been moved or her cushions replaced, signalling a dramatic shift in her standing. There's a particularly chilling account from the Qing dynasty about a concubine named Peony who discovered that her favourite sitting cushion had been stuffed with thorns instead of silk. It wasn't immediately lethal, but it was a clear message. Someone wanted her to suffer slowly, every time she tried to rest. The psychological impact was devastating. She became afraid to sit anywhere in her own room, constantly checking furniture for hidden dangers. The most insidious furniture pieces were the writing desks and book stands. These looked innocent enough, beautiful wooden pieces where women could practice calligraphy or read poetry. But many of these desks contained hidden compartments that could only be accessed by palace officials. A woman might write what she thought was a private letter, only to discover that copies were being made through a hidden mechanism in the desk itself. The furniture was literally spying on them. Storage furniture presented its own unique horrors. The beautiful wardrobes and clothing chests that lined harem bedrooms often contained more than just garments. Palace inventories show that these pieces frequently held planted evidence, items that could be discovered during inspections to implicate women in various crimes. A foreign coin, a banned book, a letter written in the wrong language. Any of these could appear in a woman's wardrobe overnight, planted there by rivals or officials. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of harem furniture was its impermanence. Women would become attached to particular pieces, a mirror that reflected light beautifully, a chair that was particularly comfortable, a jewellery box with a melody that reminded them of home. Then, without warning, these items would disappear, be replaced, or be revealed to have hidden functions that turned treasured possessions into sources of fear. The Korean Joseon dynasty palace records describe a particularly cruel practice involving furniture rotation. Every month, the women's furniture would be randomly redistributed among different rooms. This meant that no one could develop a sense of permanence or security with their possessions. The beautiful carved screen that protected your privacy this month might be moved to your rival's room next month, taking with it any secrets you might have hidden behind it. The most remarkable discovery I made in researching harem furniture was the existence of what historians call survival furniture, pieces that the women themselves modified to increase their chances of survival. A beautiful lacquered table might have a hidden compartment carved out by its owner to store emergency supplies. A decorative screen might be repositioned to create a private space for secret meetings. The women turned their oppressive environment into a landscape of hidden resources. There's a touching account from the late Ottoman period about a woman named Aishi, who spent months secretly modifying her wooden bed frame to create a tiny library where she could hide banned books and letters from her family. She used hairpins and jewellery to carve out spaces in the wood, working only at night when the guards were less attentive. When she was finally caught, instead of being punished, she was actually promoted. The officials were so impressed by her ingenuity that they decided she might be useful for other purposes. The psychological impact of living with furniture that couldn't be trusted was profound. Modern research on environmental psychology shows that our physical surroundings deeply affect our mental state. When you can't trust the most basic objects in your personal space, it creates a constant state of hypervigilance that's exhausting and dehumanizing. Yet these women found ways to adapt and resist. They developed inspection rituals, carefully examining furniture for changes or hidden mechanisms. They created silent warning systems to alert each other about dangerous pieces. They even developed emotional detachment techniques, learning not to become too attached to any possession that could be taken away or turned against them. The furniture of the Imperial Harem represents a perfect example of how power systems can corrupt even the most basic elements of human comfort and security. When a bed becomes a weapon, when a mirror becomes a spy, when a jewellery box becomes a trap, you're looking at the extreme end of authoritarian control, the colonization of personal space itself. But these women's responses also show us something powerful about human resilience. They learned to navigate a world where nothing was as it seemed, where beauty masked danger, and where survival required constant vigilance. They turned their oppressive environment into a landscape of hidden possibilities, finding ways to create safety and connection even in the most dangerous circumstances. The legacy of these furniture experiences extends far beyond the palace walls. They remind us that the objects we surround ourselves with aren't just functional. They're psychological anchors that help us feel secure in our environment. When that security is deliberately undermined, it's not just inconvenient, it's a form of psychological warfare. Now, as complex and dangerous as the furniture was, it was just one layer of a much more intricate system of control. Because the real power in the harem wasn't held by the furniture, or even by the emperor himself. It was held by the women who understood how to navigate the invisible hierarchies that determined who lived, who died, and who disappeared without a trace. And speaking of hierarchies, what I'm about to reveal about the bedroom ranking system will show you just how your sleeping position could literally seal your fate. Your sleeping position could literally determine whether you live to see tomorrow. I know that sounds impossible, but in the world of the Imperial Harem, something as simple as which side of the bed you chose to sleep on could mark you as either a rising star or a dead woman walking. The hierarchy that governed bedroom arrangements was so precise, so ruthlessly enforced, that women would spend hours each night calculating the exact angle of their pillow, the position of their feet, even the direction they faced while sleeping. Let me take you into the mind of a harem woman preparing for bed, because what you're about to learn will make your worst workplace politics look like a friendly game of checkers. In the Chinese imperial system, the bedroom hierarchy was based on something called the 9-rank system, where every woman was assigned a specific numerical ranking that determined not just her status, but literally where and how she was allowed to sleep. The highest-ranking concubines, known as imperial noble consorts, slept in beds elevated exactly 3 feet off the ground. No more, no less. The measurement was so precise that palace records show regular inspections with official measuring tools to ensure compliance. But here's where it gets really intricate. It wasn't just about bed height. Your ranking determined which direction your bed could face, how many pillows you were allowed, what materials your bedding could be made from, and even which side of the bed you had to sleep on. A woman ranked as a noble lady might be required to sleep on the right side of her bed, facing east, with exactly 2 silk pillows. Move to the left side, and you'd be violating protocol. Face west, and you'd be showing disrespect to the Emperor's quarters. The psychological pressure was immense. There's a heartbreaking account from the Qing dynasty about a woman named Chrysanthemum who was promoted from 7th rank to 5th rank after giving birth to a son. Sounds like good news, right? But the promotion meant she had to completely reorganize her sleeping arrangements overnight. New bed height, new pillow count, new sleeping position, she wrote in her secret diary. I am afraid to close my eyes, for fear I might roll to the wrong side in my sleep and wake up dead. The Ottoman Empire had an even more complex system. In the Topkapi Palace, the Sultan's harem used a ranking system where your sleeping position relative to the Sultan's chambers determined your access to power. The closer your bedroom was to his, the higher you could position your bed. But here's the twist. These positions weren't permanent. They could change daily based on the Sultan's mood, political considerations, or the influence of other women. Let me tell you about the bed wars of 1587 in the Ottoman court. When Sultan Murad III promoted a new favourite named Safiye to the rank of second consort, it triggered a domino effect that required 17 different women to physically move their beds to different positions within their rooms. But moving a bed wasn't just about calling some movers. It was a complex ritual that had to be performed at specific times, with specific ceremonies, and with the approval of multiple palace officials. The most brutal aspect of the bedroom hierarchy was how it affected relationships between the women. Your sleeping position relative to your neighbours could determine whether you were allies or enemies. In the Korean Joseon dynasty, women whose beds were positioned at the same height were considered equals and could form alliances. But if your bed was even slightly higher than your neighbours, you were expected to treat her as inferior, and she was expected to defer to you. There's a fascinating account from the Safavid court in Persia about a woman named Golnar who discovered that her bed had been secretly lowered by 2 inches overnight. This wasn't just a prank, it was a political assassination. The change in height signalled to everyone that she had fallen from favour, and within days, her former allies were treating her as untouchable. She died 3 weeks later under mysterious circumstances, but the real cause was probably isolation and despair. The logistics of maintaining these hierarchies were staggering. Palace records show that the Chinese imperial court employed over 200 officials, whose sole job was to monitor and enforce bedroom arrangements. These officials, known as chamber supervisors, would conduct daily inspections using measuring devices, checking not just bed positions but also the height of pillows, the angle of sleeping mats, and even the direction of personal items around the bed. But here's what's truly remarkable. The women found ways to game this system. They developed techniques for subtle modifications that wouldn't be detected during inspections, but would give them psychological advantages. A pillow positioned in just the right way could create the illusion of higher status. A sleeping mat angled slightly differently could signal alliances to other women while appearing compliant to officials. The most ingenious example I've found comes from the late Ming dynasty. A group of mid-ranking concubines discovered that they could create phantom hierarchies by coordinating their sleeping positions in ways that weren't technically violations, but created visual patterns that suggested different power relationships. They would arrange themselves so that their beds, when viewed from above, formed specific geometric patterns that communicated their true alliances and loyalties. The psychological impact of these sleeping hierarchies was devastating. Modern sleep researchers tell us that our sleeping environment deeply affects our mental health and stress levels. When you can't relax in your own bed because you're constantly calculating whether you're in the right position, sleep becomes another form of work, another source of anxiety. There's a particularly moving account from a palace servant who worked during the Qing dynasty. She described watching new arrivals to the harem trying to learn the sleeping protocols. They would lie awake for hours, she wrote, practicing different positions, measuring distances with their hands, afraid to close their eyes lest they shift into the wrong position while dreaming. The enforcement of these hierarchies was brutal. Palace records document numerous cases of women being punished for sleeping violations. A woman named Jade Flower was sentenced to 3 months of confinement for sleeping diagonally across her bed, a position that was considered imperial and therefore forbidden to concubines. Another woman, Plum Blossom, was demoted 2 ranks for using 3 pillows instead of the 2 allowed for her status. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect was how these hierarchies affected the women's sense of self. When your worth is literally measured by the height of your bed and the angle of your pillow, you start to internalize these external measures of value. Women would begin to judge themselves and others based on these arbitrary physical arrangements. The Ottoman system included something even more sinister: sleeping audits. Senior concubines would be assigned to secretly observe the sleeping positions of junior women and report any violations. This meant that even in sleep, the most vulnerable and private state, women were being watched and judged by their peers. Yet even in this oppressive system, there were moments of quiet rebellion. Palace records show instances of women deliberately violating sleeping protocols as a form of protest. A woman facing execution might choose to sleep in the imperial position as a final act of defiance. Others would coordinate subtle violations as a way of showing solidarity with fallen friends. The most touching example I've found comes from the late Joseon dynasty, when a popular concubine named Moonflower was condemned to death. Her friends throughout the harem deliberately violated their sleeping protocols on her final night. They slept in forbidden positions, used unauthorized pillows, and faced the wrong directions. It was a silent protest that said, "If our friend must die, then we refuse to live by rules that killed her." The complexity of these hierarchies also created opportunities for manipulation. Clever women learned to use the system to their advantage, subtly adjusting their sleeping arrangements to send messages or create impressions. A woman might gradually adjust her bed position over several weeks, creating the illusion of rising status that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The records from the Mughal court describe a woman named Nur Jahan, who mastered the art of hierarchical positioning. She would adjust her sleeping arrangements so subtly that officials wouldn't notice the changes, but other women would understand that she was claiming higher status. Eventually, her physical positioning began to influence her actual political position, and she became one of the most powerful women in the empire. What strikes me most about these bedroom hierarchies is how they reveal the lengths to which power systems will go to control every aspect of human life. When a government can dictate not just what you do while awake, but how you position your body while unconscious, you're looking at totalitarian control taken to its logical extreme. These women lived in a world where their very dreams were regulated, where the most basic human need for rest became another arena for competition and control. Yet they found ways to resist, to rebel, and to maintain their humanity even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The legacy of these bedroom hierarchies extends far beyond the palace walls. They remind us that systems of oppression don't just control obvious things like speech and movement. They colonize the most intimate and private aspects of human existence. When you control how someone sleeps, you control their subconscious, their dreams, their most fundamental sense of safety and security. Now, as restrictive as these sleeping hierarchies were, they were just one part of a much larger system of control that extended to every object a woman was allowed to possess. Because in the harem, ownership itself was a dangerous concept, and possessing the wrong item, even something as innocent as a book or a piece of jewellery, could be a death sentence. And speaking of dangerous possessions, wait until you discover the everyday items that could get you executed simply for having them in your bedroom. Owning the wrong book in your bedroom wasn't just illegal, it was a death sentence. Imagine living in a world where a simple hair ornament could cost you your life, where keeping a letter from your family could be considered an act of treason, and where even the wrong type of teacup could mark you as a dangerous rebel. This was the reality for women in the Imperial Harem, where every single possession was scrutinized, catalogued, and could potentially become evidence against you. The list of forbidden items in harem bedrooms was so extensive and so bizarre that it would make modern airport security look relaxed. But these weren't just random restrictions. They were carefully crafted tools of psychological control that reached into every corner of a woman's personal life. Let me start with books, because this is where the paranoia reached almost comical levels. In the Chinese imperial system, women were allowed to own exactly 7 types of books: approved poetry collections, imperial histories, moral instruction guides, embroidery patterns, music notation for court songs, basic medical texts, and religious scriptures approved by the court. That's it. 7 categories, all pre-approved by palace censors. But here's where it gets really twisted. Even owning an approved book could be dangerous if you owned the wrong edition. There's a documented case from 1654 where a concubine named Willow was executed for possessing a poetry collection that contained a poem praising the previous dynasty. She had no idea the poem was even in there. It was hidden on page 247 of a 300-page book, but ignorance was no defense. The Ottoman Empire took book censorship to even more extreme levels. In the Topkapi Palace, women were forbidden from owning any books written in foreign languages, even if they could read them. This included Arabic religious texts, Persian poetry, and even Turkish books written in different scripts. The paranoia was so intense that women caught with foreign books were assumed to be spies, regardless of how innocent the content might be. But books were just the beginning. Personal letters were perhaps the most dangerous items a woman could possess. In the Korean Joseon dynasty, women were allowed to receive letters from family members, but only after they had been read, copied, and approved by palace censors. The original letters were often destroyed, and the women received heavily edited versions that bore little resemblance to what their families had actually written. There's a heartbreaking account from the Qing dynasty about a woman named Orchid who kept a letter from her dying mother hidden in her pillow for 3 years. When it was finally discovered during a routine inspection, she was charged with maintaining unauthorized correspondence and sentenced to permanent exile in the cold palace. The letter contained nothing but a mother's love and concern for her daughter. But in the paranoid world of the harem, even maternal affection was seen as a potential threat. The restrictions on personal items extended to the most intimate possessions. Women were forbidden from keeping anything that connected them to their previous lives. No family jewellery, no childhood toys, no personal mementos. The goal was to completely erase their identities as individuals and remake them as extensions of imperial will. Musical instruments were particularly dangerous. In the Mughal court, women were allowed to own specific types of instruments for court performances, but possessing instruments from their home regions was forbidden. A woman from Bengal caught with a traditional Bengali flute could be charged with cultural sedition, the idea being that regional music might inspire loyalty to something other than the emperor. The most absurd restrictions involved food items. Women were forbidden from keeping certain spices, teas, or preserved foods from their home regions. Palace records from the Safavid court in Persia show that women were regularly punished for possessing unauthorized seasonings. One woman was sentenced to 6 months of confinement for keeping a small pouch of her grandmother's special tea blend hidden in her jewellery box. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating restrictions involved religious items. Women were allowed to practice court-approved versions of religion, but any personal religious objects were forbidden. Prayer beads from home, family religious texts, even small protective amulets given by parents. All of these were considered contraband that could result in severe punishment. The enforcement of these restrictions was conducted through surprise raids that would make modern police searches look gentle. Teams of eunuchs would descend on a woman's room without warning, systematically searching every inch of the space. They would examine the binding of books, feel inside clothing for hidden pockets, and even taste food to ensure it wasn't flavoured with forbidden spices. The psychological impact of these searches was devastating. Historical accounts describe women becoming paralysed with fear, unable to form attachments to any possessions because they knew everything could be taken away at any moment. Some women developed what we might now recognise as hoarding behaviours in reverse. They would deliberately own as little as possible to minimise the risk of accidentally possessing something forbidden. There's a particularly tragic account from the late Ming dynasty about a woman named Jasmine who became so afraid of owning forbidden items that she would regularly destroy her own possessions. She would burn approved books after reading them, throw away gifts from other women, and even refuse to keep basic necessities like extra clothing. When she was finally found dead in her room, investigators discovered she'd been living in almost complete poverty, surrounded by wealth, but afraid to touch any of it. The most insidious aspect of these restrictions was how they were used to create evidence against women who had fallen from favour. Palace records show numerous cases where forbidden items were mysteriously discovered in women's rooms after they had been marked for elimination. A banned book would appear under a mattress. Foreign coins would be found in jewellery boxes. Unauthorised letters would materialise in clothing chests. The women knew this was happening and developed elaborate defence strategies. They would create witness networks, where groups of women would take turns watching each other's rooms to prevent evidence from being planted. They developed inventory systems, maintaining detailed mental catalogues of every item they owned, so they could immediately detect if something had been added. Some women turned the system against itself. A clever concubine named Bamboo in the Qing dynasty court would deliberately plant obviously fake evidence in her room, items so ridiculous that any investigation would reveal them as planted. A book written in a language she couldn't read, coins from a country that didn't exist, letters supposedly from dead relatives. When investigators found these items, the obviousness of the setup would actually protect her from real accusations. The restrictions also created underground economies within the harem. Women would develop elaborate systems for sharing forbidden items. A book might be passed from room to room, read quickly, and moved on before inspections. Letters from home would be memorized and destroyed, then recreated from memory and shared with others who missed their families. The most touching example I've found comes from the Ottoman court, where a group of women created what they called the memory library. Since they couldn't keep books from their homelands, they would take turns reciting entire stories, poems, and songs from memory. These oral performances became treasured events, ways of preserving their cultural heritage in a system designed to erase it. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these restrictions was how they revealed the women's incredible creativity and resilience. Faced with rules designed to strip away their humanity, they found ways to maintain their connections to home, family, and culture. They turned their memories into libraries, their friendships into protection networks, and their survival instincts into forms of resistance. The legacy of these possession restrictions extends far beyond the palace walls. They represent a perfect example of how authoritarian systems use the control of personal property as a tool of psychological domination. When you can't own a letter from your mother, a book that interests you, or a piece of jewellery that reminds you of home, you're being systematically disconnected from your own identity. These women's responses also show us something powerful about human nature. Even when stripped of almost all personal possessions, people will find ways to maintain their connections to what matters most. They'll memorize poems when books are forbidden, recreate recipes when spices are banned, and preserve family stories when letters are destroyed. The restrictions on personal possessions in the Imperial Harem remind us that freedom isn't just about big political rights. It's also about the small, intimate freedoms that make us human. The right to keep a letter from home, to own a book that interests you, to possess objects that connect you to your past. These aren't luxuries. They're fundamental to human dignity. Now, as oppressive as these possession restrictions were, they were just one part of a much larger system of control that extended to every aspect of daily life. Because the harem didn't just control what you could own, it controlled how you had to behave, and there were specific rituals and customs that could literally keep you alive if you performed them correctly. And speaking of survival rituals, what I'm about to share with you will reveal the ingenious ways these women turned seemingly crazy superstitions into brilliant survival strategies. Every night, they performed a ritual that seemed crazy, but was actually genius survival strategy. What if I told you that the women of the Imperial Harem developed bedtime routines so sophisticated that they could predict danger, avoid punishment, and sometimes even save their lives. These weren't just superstitions or religious practices. They were carefully crafted survival mechanisms disguised as innocent nighttime rituals. The most remarkable thing about these sleeping rituals was how they looked completely normal to outsiders, while serving as complex early warning systems for the women who performed them. To a casual observer, they were simply preparing for bed, but to the trained eye of a harem woman, every gesture, every prayer, every arrangement of objects was part of an intricate survival protocol. Let me start with what the Chinese concubines called the 5 protections ritual. Every night before sleep, a woman would perform 5 specific actions that appeared to be spiritual preparations but were actually safety checks. She would light incense, but the real purpose was to check if the air in her room smelled different, which could indicate the presence of poison gas. She would arrange her jewellery in a specific pattern, but this was actually a way to detect if anyone had been in her room while she was away. The 3rd protection involved brushing her hair exactly 100 times while reciting prayers. The prayers were real, but the counting served a dual purpose. It helped her maintain mental clarity and alertness, while the repetitive motion allowed her to listen carefully for unusual sounds in the palace corridors. The 4th protection was arranging her sleeping clothes in a particular way, which created a system for detecting if someone had moved her belongings. The 5th protection was placing a small mirror under her pillow, positioned to reflect light from the hallway so she could detect approaching footsteps even while sleeping. But here's what's truly brilliant about this system. It was taught to new arrivals as a religious practice. Senior women would tell newcomers that these rituals would bring them good fortune and protect them from evil spirits. The younger women would perform them faithfully, not realizing they were actually learning sophisticated survival techniques disguised as superstition. The Ottoman harem had similar practices, but their rituals were even more elaborate. Turkish palace records describe a bedtime ceremony called the evening invocation that could take up to an hour to complete. Women would light 7 different types of candles in a specific sequence, each one serving as a check for different types of danger. The first candle tested for gas poisoning, the second for unusual drafts that might indicate hidden passages, the third for the presence of metallic objects that shouldn't be there. The most ingenious part of the Ottoman ritual was the dream preparation phase. Women would spend 20 minutes arranging small objects around their bed: a cup of water, a piece of bread, a flower, a coin, and a small piece of fabric. To observers, this looked like spiritual preparation for prophetic dreams. In reality, these objects were positioned to detect movement in the room. If someone entered while the woman was sleeping, they would inevitably disturb one of these items, creating an early warning system. The Korean Joseon dynasty developed what they called the protection weaving. Every night, women would spend time braiding and unbraiding their hair, their jewellery cords, and even the ties on their clothing. This looked like a beauty ritual, but the real purpose was to create a complex pattern that would reveal if anyone had touched their belongings. If a woman woke up and found her braids disturbed, she would know someone had been in her room. But perhaps the most sophisticated ritual came from the Mughal court, where women practiced something called the silence meditation. For 30 minutes before sleep, they would sit in complete silence, appearing to meditate or pray. But they weren't just sitting quietly. They were systematically listening to the palace, learning the normal sounds of night, memorizing the footsteps of different guards, and detecting any unusual activities in their area. These rituals also served important psychological functions. Living in constant fear and paranoia takes a tremendous toll on mental health. The bedtime rituals gave women a sense of control and agency in an environment where they had almost none. By performing these protective actions, they felt they were actively doing something to ensure their survival, rather than just passively waiting for fate to determine their future. There's a beautiful account from the Qing dynasty about a woman named Peach Blossom, who taught the protection rituals to over 50 younger women during her 20 years in the harem. She would present them as ancient spiritual practices passed down through generations of wise women. The younger women found comfort in these rituals, not knowing they were actually learning practical survival skills that had been developed through centuries of trial and error. The most touching aspect of these rituals was how they created bonds between women. The teaching and learning process required trust and intimacy. A senior woman couldn't teach these practices to someone she didn't trust, and a junior woman had to demonstrate loyalty and discretion to be included in the instruction. The rituals became a way of identifying allies and building networks of mutual protection. But these practices could also be dangerous. Palace records show cases where women were punished for performing rituals that were deemed too complex or suspiciously elaborate. The authorities sometimes recognized that these practices might be serving purposes beyond spiritual preparation. Women had to be extremely careful to make their survival rituals look appropriately religious and traditional. The most remarkable example I've found comes from the late Ottoman period. A woman named Hatice developed a ritual that appeared to be a simple evening prayer, but was actually a sophisticated communication system. Through the timing of her movements, the position of her hands, and the sequence of her prayers, she could send coded messages to women in adjacent rooms. The authorities never caught on because the ritual looked completely normal. She was just a devout woman saying her evening prayers. The group rituals were even more powerful. In the Chinese imperial system, women would sometimes perform collective protection ceremonies, where dozens of women would participate in what appeared to be communal worship. In reality, these gatherings allowed them to share information about palace politics, warn each other about dangers, and coordinate their individual protection strategies. These group rituals also served as early warning systems for the entire harem. If a woman discovered a threat, perhaps she noticed unusual guard movements or overheard a dangerous conversation, she could incorporate warnings into the group ritual without anyone else noticing. A slight change in the traditional sequence, a different gesture, or an altered prayer could alert dozens of women to impending danger. The rituals evolved over time, adapting to new threats and changing circumstances. When the palace introduced new surveillance methods, the women would modify their practices accordingly. When punishment patterns changed, they would adjust their protective measures. It was a constantly evolving system of survival that demonstrated incredible collective intelligence and adaptability. Modern research on trauma and survival shows that rituals can indeed provide psychological protection in dangerous environments. The predictable structure of ritual behavior can reduce anxiety, while the sense of personal agency involved in performing protective actions can help maintain mental health under stress. These harem women intuitively understood principles that modern psychology has only recently begun to explore. The most poignant aspect of these rituals was how they helped women maintain their humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. By creating these practices, they were asserting their right to protect themselves, to make choices about their own welfare, and to maintain connections with each other. In a system designed to reduce them to passive objects, these rituals allowed them to remain active agents in their own survival. The legacy of these sleeping rituals extends far beyond the palace walls. They represent a powerful example of how marginalized groups develop hidden practices that serve both practical and psychological functions. From the protective rituals of enslaved communities to the survival practices of prisoners of war, humans consistently find ways to create agency and connection, even in the most oppressive circumstances. These women's bedtime rituals remind us that survival isn't just about physical safety. It's also about maintaining mental health, building social connections, and preserving a sense of personal dignity. They show that even in the most controlled environments, people can find ways to protect themselves and each other through creativity, cooperation, and courage. The rituals of the Imperial Harem also demonstrate the incredible power of collective knowledge. These practices weren't developed by any single person. They were the result of centuries of women sharing experiences, learning from each other's mistakes, and refining their techniques through trial and error. They represent a form of cultural wisdom that was passed down through generations of survivors. Now, as ingenious as these survival rituals were, they were just one part of a much larger challenge these women faced. because while they were trying to protect themselves from external threats, they also had to navigate the complex web of relationships within the harem itself, and the most dangerous relationships of all were often with the very people who seemed like they should be their allies. Speaking of dangerous relationships, what I'm about to reveal about the spy networks operating within these bedrooms will show you that the person sharing your most intimate secrets might have been your greatest enemy. The woman sharing your bed might not have been your friend. She might have been reporting your every move. Trust is a luxury that few could afford in the Imperial Harem, but intimacy was unavoidable. Women shared rooms, beds, and their deepest secrets with people who might have been documenting every word for their superiors. What I'm about to reveal about the spy networks operating within these bedrooms will fundamentally change how you think about friendship, loyalty, and survival under authoritarian rule. The most chilling aspect of harem life wasn't the obvious surveillance by guards and eunuchs. It was the invisible network of informants among the women themselves. These weren't necessarily cruel or malicious people. They were often just desperate women trying to survive in a system that rewarded betrayal and punished solidarity. In the Chinese imperial system, the spy network was so sophisticated that it had its own hierarchy and promotion system. Palace records from the Ming dynasty reveal that women who provided valuable intelligence could earn better sleeping quarters, improved food rations, and even protection from punishment. The authorities had essentially created a system where survival depended on your willingness to betray other women. The recruitment process was diabolical in its psychological precision. New arrivals to the harem would be assigned mentors, experienced women who would teach them the rules, help them navigate palace politics, and provide emotional support during the difficult adjustment period. These mentors were often genuinely caring people who formed real bonds with their charges, but many of them were also required to report on their mentees' activities, creating relationships that were simultaneously loving and exploitative. Let me tell you about the case of Lotus and Jade, two women in the Qing dynasty harem whose friendship lasted over 15 years. They shared a room, supported each other through countless crises, and developed what appeared to be an unbreakable bond. But when palace archives were finally opened in the 20th century, historians discovered that Lotus had been filing detailed reports on Jade's activities for the entire duration of their friendship. The reports were heartbreaking. They showed genuine affection mixed with professional obligation, love intertwined with betrayal. The Ottoman Empire perfected what they called the sisterhood system, where women were organized into small groups that provided mutual support and protection. But within each group, at least one member was secretly reporting to the authorities. The genius of this system was that it created real intimacy and genuine care while simultaneously gathering intelligence. Women would share their fears, dreams, and secrets with people who truly cared about them and who were also documenting everything for their superiors. The most insidious aspect of these spy networks was how they corrupted the very relationships that should have provided emotional support. In the Korean Joseon dynasty, women developed what they called testing friendships, relationships where they would gradually reveal increasingly sensitive information to see if it would be reported. If a woman shared a minor secret and faced no consequences, she might risk sharing something more significant. But if she was punished for a minor revelation, she would know her friend was an informant. The psychological toll of living in this environment was devastating. Historical accounts describe women becoming unable to form genuine attachments, constantly analysing every interaction for signs of betrayal. A woman named Chrysanthemum, whose diary survived from the Qing dynasty, wrote, "I have learned to love with only half my heart, for the other half must always be guarded against the possibility that today's friend will be tomorrow's accuser." But here's what's truly remarkable. Even within this system of mutual surveillance, women found ways to maintain authentic relationships. They developed what historians call protective intimacy, ways of being genuinely close while minimizing the risk of betrayal. They would share emotional support without revealing specific information, provide comfort without divulging secrets, and create bonds that were real but carefully bounded. The most sophisticated example I've found comes from the Mughal court, where women developed a practice called layered friendship. They would maintain different levels of intimacy with different people, sharing increasingly sensitive information only with those who had proven their trustworthiness over time. A woman might have dozens of casual friendships, several close relationships, and perhaps only one or two truly intimate bonds where complete honesty was possible. The authorities understood that these spy networks were corrupting the very relationships they were meant to monitor. Palace records show periodic attempts to reform the system, but the fundamental problem was unsolvable. Any system that depends on betrayal will inevitably destroy the trust necessary for authentic human connection. The most heartbreaking aspect was how the spy networks affected women's ability to seek help when they needed it most. If you were sick, depressed, or facing a crisis, reaching out for support meant risking exposure. Women learned to suffer in silence rather than trust others with their vulnerabilities. The system didn't just gather intelligence, it isolated women from the very relationships that could have helped them survive. Yet even in this environment of mutual surveillance, acts of extraordinary courage and loyalty still occurred. There are documented cases of women refusing to report on friends even when faced with severe punishment. A woman named Peony in the Ming Dynasty was tortured for 3 days because she refused to reveal information about her roommate's activities. She eventually died from her injuries, but she never betrayed her friend. The spy networks also created opportunities for double agents, women who appeared to be informants but were actually protecting their targets. A clever woman named Jasmine in the Qing Dynasty court spent years filing reports about her friends that were technically accurate, but carefully worded to minimize harm. She would report that a woman had been discussing family matters, rather than specifying that she was planning to contact relatives outside the palace. The most ingenious resistance came from women who turned the surveillance system against itself. They would form what appeared to be informant networks but were actually protection circles. A group of women would agree to file reports about each other that were coordinated and harmless, describing approved activities and proper behaviour while covering up any actual violations or dangerous activities. The psychological research on informant networks shows that they create what's called social fragmentation, the breakdown of normal social bonds that leads to isolation, paranoia, and mental health problems. The women of the Imperial Harem experienced this fragmentation in its most extreme form, but they also developed remarkable strategies for maintaining human connection despite the surveillance. The most touching examples come from the coded communications that women developed to express love and loyalty despite the surveillance. They would use the secret languages we discussed earlier, not just to share information, but to communicate care and affection in ways that couldn't be reported. A particular gesture or fabric arrangement might mean, "I love you and I'm not betraying you," a way of maintaining emotional bonds within a system designed to destroy them. The long-term effects of these spy networks extended far beyond the palace walls. Women who survived the harem often struggled with relationships for the rest of their lives. They had learned to see potential betrayal in every friendship, to guard their secrets even from those they loved, and to maintain emotional distance as a survival strategy. But the legacy of these experiences also includes remarkable examples of human resilience and creativity. The women who survived the harem spy networks developed skills in reading human nature, building trust gradually, and maintaining loyalty under extreme pressure. They learned to distinguish between genuine care and manipulative attention, between authentic friendship and professional obligation. The spy networks of the Imperial Harem represent one of the most sophisticated examples of how authoritarian systems use social relationships as tools of control. By turning friends into potential enemies, the authorities didn't just gather intelligence, they prevented the formation of the social bonds that could have provided emotional support and collective resistance. Yet even in this environment of mutual surveillance, human connection persisted. Love found ways to exist despite the danger. Loyalty survived despite the rewards for betrayal, and friendship endured despite the risks. The women of the harem showed us that the human need for authentic connection is so strong that it can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. The story of these bedroom spies also reminds us that surveillance systems don't just watch people, they change them. When you know that your most intimate relationships might be compromised, you begin to modify your behaviour, your speech, even your thoughts. The most insidious forms of control are those that make you surveil yourself. Now, as complex as these spy networks were, they were just one part of an even more intricate system of control that governed every aspect of reproduction and motherhood in the harem. Because if you thought the bedroom surveillance was invasive, wait until you discover what happened when a woman became pregnant. The rules that governed pregnancy in the Imperial Harem were so bizarre and restrictive that they truly do sound like something from science fiction. If you got pregnant, your bedroom became a prison with rules so bizarre they sound made up. Pregnancy should be a time of joy and anticipation, but in the Imperial Harem, it transformed a woman's life into something that resembles a dystopian nightmare. The moment a concubine's pregnancy was confirmed, she entered a world of restrictions so extreme and bizarre that they challenge everything we think we know about how societies have treated expectant mothers throughout history. The transformation was immediate and total. Within hours of a positive pregnancy confirmation, a woman's bedroom would be completely restructured according to ancient protocols that had been refined over centuries. But these weren't just safety precautions. They were elaborate systems of control that turned pregnancy into a form of luxurious imprisonment. In the Chinese imperial system, a pregnant concubine's room would be sealed off from the rest of the harem and transformed into what they called a jade chamber. The walls would be painted in specific colours believed to influence the child's character: gold for imperial virtue, white for purity, and red for strength. But here's the twist. The woman herself had no say in these colour choices. Palace officials would examine her astrological charts, consult with court physicians, and make decisions about her environment based on their interpretation of what the unborn child needed. The Ottoman Empire took this concept even further. Turkish palace records describe pregnancy palaces, entire sections of the harem that were redesigned around the needs of expectant mothers. But these weren't comfortable retreats. They were highly controlled environments where every aspect of a woman's life was regulated according to complex medical and spiritual beliefs. Let me tell you about the dietary restrictions, because they were absolutely mind-boggling. A pregnant concubine in the Qing dynasty couldn't eat any food that hadn't been blessed by court physicians, tested by official tasters, and prepared according to recipes that were hundreds of years old. Palace records show that pregnant women were given exactly 7 different meals, rotated according to a precise schedule based on lunar cycles and astrological calculations. But here's where it gets really strange. The food wasn't just regulated by type, but by temperature, texture, and even the direction the woman faced while eating. A pregnant concubine might be required to eat her morning meal facing east while standing, her midday meal facing south while seated, and her evening meal facing west while kneeling. The reasoning was that different directions would channel different types of energy to the developing child. The sleep restrictions were even more extreme. In the Korean Joseon dynasty, pregnant women were required to sleep in positions that were calculated to optimize the child's development. This meant sleeping on their left side during certain lunar phases, on their right side during others, and sometimes not being allowed to sleep lying down at all. Palace records describe special furniture designed to support women who were required to sleep in semi-upright positions for weeks at a time. The most bizarre aspect was the conversation restrictions. In the Mughal court, pregnant women were forbidden from speaking certain words that were believed to negatively influence the child's development. They couldn't mention death, disease, or anything related to misfortune. They couldn't speak the names of previous emperors who had died young. They couldn't even use words that sounded similar to forbidden terms. Imagine being pregnant and having to mentally edit every sentence before speaking to avoid accidentally saying something that could be interpreted as harmful to your child. But here's what's truly disturbing. These restrictions were often based on the gender of the expected child. If court physicians determined that a woman was carrying a male heir, her restrictions would become even more extreme. She might be forbidden from seeing sunlight, prohibited from touching certain materials, or required to maintain silence for hours at a time. The reasoning was that male heirs were more precious and therefore required more extreme protection. The Ottoman system included something called the watching ceremony, where teams of women would take shifts observing pregnant concubines around the clock. These watchers didn't just monitor the woman's health, they documented her every movement, word, and expression. The idea was that the child's character was being formed by the mother's behaviour, so every action needed to be controlled and recorded. The psychological impact was devastating. Historical accounts describe women becoming afraid to move, speak, or even think freely during pregnancy. A woman named Willow, whose diary survived from the Ming Dynasty, wrote, "I have become a vessel, not a person. I am afraid to breathe too deeply, to dream too vividly, to feel too strongly, lest I damage the precious cargo I carry." But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was the social isolation. Once a woman became pregnant, she was often cut off from her friends and support networks. The authorities believed that emotional disturbance could harm the child, so pregnant women were kept in a state of artificial calm that was actually profoundly isolating and depressing. The Ottoman Empire developed something called happiness protocols for pregnant women. These were elaborate rituals designed to keep expectant mothers in a constant state of joy and contentment. Sounds nice, right? But in practice, it meant that pregnant women were forbidden from expressing any negative emotions. They couldn't cry, complain, or even discuss their fears about childbirth. They had to maintain a facade of perfect happiness while dealing with the physical and emotional challenges of pregnancy and isolation. The most absurd restrictions involved physical appearance. In the Chinese imperial system, pregnant women were required to maintain specific beauty standards throughout their pregnancy. They had to continue elaborate makeup routines, wear specially designed clothing that concealed their changing bodies, and even practice facial expressions that were considered beneficial for the child's development. The idea was that the child would be influenced by the mother's appearance and demeanour, but here's where human ingenuity shines through. The women found ways to resist and support each other despite these restrictions. They developed coded communication systems specifically for pregnant women, using symbols and gestures that could convey comfort and encouragement without violating the silence rules. They created hidden networks of support that operated beneath the official surveillance. The most touching example comes from the Qing dynasty, where a group of women developed what they called the Mother's Circle. When one woman became pregnant and was isolated according to protocol, the others would find ways to send her small gifts and messages of support. They would hide encouraging notes in her food, arrange flowers in patterns that conveyed love and strength, and even coordinate their own activities to provide comfort through shared rituals she could observe from her window. The medical care during pregnancy was equally bizarre. Palace physicians would make treatment decisions based on astrological charts rather than the woman's actual health needs. A pregnant concubine might be required to take medicines that were chosen based on the day of the week she conceived, or undergo treatments that were designed to influence the child's future personality rather than address current health concerns. The most dangerous aspect was how these restrictions could interfere with actual medical care. Palace records show cases where pregnant women were forbidden from reporting symptoms that might indicate complications, because discussing potential problems was considered harmful to the child. Women suffered in silence with conditions that could have been easily treated if they had been allowed to communicate freely with medical providers. The birth preparations were equally elaborate and restrictive. Months before the due date, the woman's bedroom would be transformed into a birthing chamber according to precise specifications. The position of the bed, the colour of the curtains, even the type of incense burned in the room would be determined by palace officials rather than medical professionals or the woman herself. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was what happened to women who miscarried or whose children didn't survive. In addition to dealing with their grief, they faced investigation and potential punishment for failing in their primary duty. The same restrictions that were supposed to protect their pregnancies became evidence against them if anything went wrong. The legacy of these pregnancy restrictions extends far beyond the palace walls. They represent an extreme example of how societies have used reproduction as a tool of control, turning one of the most natural human experiences into a heavily regulated state function. The women who endured these restrictions showed incredible resilience, finding ways to maintain their humanity and support each other, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. These stories also remind us that the control of women's reproductive lives has always been a central tool of authoritarian systems. When you control how a woman can behave during pregnancy, you're controlling not just her body, but her mind, her relationships, and her sense of self. The bizarre bedroom rules of imperial pregnancy were just one manifestation of this broader pattern of reproductive control. Now, as extreme as these pregnancy restrictions were, they were just one part of a much larger economic system that operated in secret within the harem walls, because while the women were dealing with all these rules and restrictions, they were also creating something remarkable, an entire underground economy that the authorities knew nothing about. And speaking of hidden economies, what I'm about to reveal about the secret financial networks operating within these bedrooms will show you that even in the most controlled environment, human entrepreneurship finds a way to flourish. Inside these bedrooms, women created an entire black market economy that even the emperor didn't know about. While palace officials thought they controlled every aspect of harem life, they had no idea that right under their noses, a sophisticated underground economy was thriving. The women had created their own currency, their own banks, their own trade networks, and their own financial systems that operated entirely in secret within the confines of their bedrooms. The most remarkable thing about this hidden economy was how it transformed the very restrictions meant to control the women into opportunities for entrepreneurship. Every limitation became a business opportunity, every rule created a new market, and every forbidden item became a valuable commodity. In the Chinese imperial system, the official policy was that women had no need for money since all their needs were provided by the state. But palace records that were discovered centuries later reveal a completely different reality. The women had developed what historians now call favor currency, a complex system where influence, access, and services were traded like stocks on Wall Street. Here's how it worked. A woman who had recently gained the emperor's favor would suddenly have access to better food, nicer clothing, and more comfortable accommodations. But instead of just enjoying these privileges, clever women would rent them out to others. A high-ranking concubine might allow a lower-ranking woman to sleep in her more comfortable bed for a night, in exchange for information about palace politics. Or she might share her better meals in return for help with embroidery work or other services. The most successful entrepreneur I've encountered was a woman named Golden Lotus from the Ming dynasty. Palace inventory records show that she somehow accumulated enough luxury items to furnish dozens of rooms, despite officially owning only the basic possessions allocated to her rank. How did she do it? She'd created what we would now recognize as a rental business. Women would pay her to borrow jewellery for special occasions, to use her better furniture for important meetings, or to access her collection of books and entertainment items. The Ottoman harem developed an even more sophisticated system. Turkish palace documents describe something called the silk exchange, where women would trade everything from clothing and jewellery to rumours and romantic letters. The exchange rates were complex. A piece of information about the Sultan's mood might be worth 3 silk scarves, while a letter from a woman's family might cost 5 pieces of jewellery and a month of laundry service. But here's where it gets really interesting. These economies had their own banks. Women would pool their resources to create lending systems where those in need could borrow items or services in exchange for future repayment with interest. A woman facing a crisis might borrow enough luxury items to impress palace officials, then repay the debt over time through labour or by trading her own privileges. The most ingenious aspect was how they created currency out of nothing. In the Korean Joseon dynasty, women developed a system where pieces of coloured thread became a form of money. Different colours had different values, and women would accumulate and trade these threads like we trade dollar bills. The authorities never caught on because thread was a necessary item for embroidery and clothing repair. It looked completely innocent. The entrepreneurial creativity was extraordinary. Women would create businesses around their unique skills or access. A woman who was particularly good at reading and writing might become a letter-writing service, helping illiterate women communicate with family members or compose petitions to palace officials. A woman with access to the imperial kitchens might start a food delivery service, smuggling better meals to women in other parts of the harem. The most touching example comes from the Qing dynasty, where a woman named Peony created what was essentially a mental health service. She would visit women who were struggling with depression, anxiety, or homesickness, providing emotional support and practical advice. Her payment? Small luxuries like flowers, perfumes, or special foods that her clients would save from their own allocations. The black market for forbidden items was particularly lucrative. Remember how we discussed all those items that women weren't allowed to own? Well, they created underground networks to obtain and circulate these forbidden goods. A letter from home might change hands dozens of times, with each woman paying to read it and gaining comfort from knowing others shared similar experiences. The most dangerous but profitable business was in contraband books. Palace records show that some women became essentially underground librarians, maintaining hidden collections of banned literature and renting access to other women. They would memorize entire books so they could recreate them if the originals were discovered and destroyed. The cosmetics trade was equally sophisticated. Women would create their own beauty products using ingredients smuggled from the palace kitchens, then sell these products to others who wanted to enhance their appearance for imperial visits. Some women became so skilled at creating cosmetics that they could command premium prices for their custom formulations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these economies was how they created genuine economic empowerment for women who were supposed to be powerless. Through these underground markets, women could accumulate wealth, build businesses, and gain influence that was completely independent of their official status in the harem hierarchy. The most successful businesswoman I've researched was a woman named Jasmine from the Ottoman court. She started by trading small favours and eventually built what was essentially an import-export business, smuggling luxury goods between different sections of the harem. By the time she died, she had accumulated enough wealth to provide dowries for dozens of younger women and had created a network of business partners throughout the palace. These economies also created jobs and career opportunities. Women would specialize in different trades. Some became tailors, others became teachers, still others became entertainers or storytellers. The harem developed its own internal job market where women could build careers and develop professional skills despite being officially classified as imperial property. The payment systems were incredibly creative. Since traditional money was forbidden, women developed complex barter systems using everything from hairpins and jewellery to food portions and sleeping privileges. Some women became currency exchangers, helping others convert between different types of payment and facilitating complex multi-party trades. The most sophisticated financial instrument was what historians call future favours, essentially promises to provide services or access at a later date. A woman might promise to introduce someone to a high-ranking official in exchange for current assistance with a problem. These promises were taken very seriously and created long-term financial relationships that could span years. The authorities occasionally discovered parts of these underground economies, but they never understood the full scope of what was happening. Palace records show periodic crackdowns on unauthorized trading, but the women would simply adapt their methods and continue operating. They developed increasingly sophisticated ways to hide their activities, using the same secret communication systems we discussed earlier to coordinate their business operations. The most remarkable aspect was how these economies created social mobility within the harem. A woman who started with nothing could build a business, accumulate wealth, and eventually gain influence that rivaled officially high-ranking concubines. The underground economy provided opportunities for advancement that the official system denied. These hidden economies also created insurance systems. Women would pool resources to help each other during crises. If someone fell ill, lost favour, or faced punishment, the group would provide support to help her survive the difficult period. It was like a mutual aid society operating entirely in secret. The legacy of these bedroom economies extends far beyond the palace walls. They represent powerful examples of how people create economic opportunities even in the most restrictive circumstances. These women show that entrepreneurship and innovation can flourish even when official systems try to suppress them. The underground economies of the Imperial Harem also demonstrate the fundamental human drive for economic agency. Even when reduced to the status of property, these women found ways to create value, build businesses, and accumulate wealth. They turned their prison into a marketplace, and their restrictions into opportunities. Modern economists studying these historical examples are amazed by their sophistication. These women intuitively understood principles of supply and demand, currency creation, and market dynamics that wouldn't be formally theorized until centuries later. They created functioning economies using nothing but creativity, trust, and determination. Now, as impressive as these underground economies were, they were just one part of a much larger system of resistance and survival. Because while the women were building businesses and accumulating wealth, they were also dealing with something far more sinister, a punishment system so brutal that it made physical death seem like mercy. And speaking of punishments, what I'm about to reveal about the bedroom-based torture methods used in the Imperial Harem will show you why women would literally beg for execution rather than face certain forms of imperial justice. Being sent to the cold palace wasn't just exile, it was a fate so terrible that women begged for execution instead. When we think of punishment, we usually imagine physical pain that ends relatively quickly, but the Imperial Harem had perfected something far more devastating. Psychological torture that could last for decades, delivered through the very bedroom spaces that were supposed to provide comfort and safety. The most feared punishment in the Chinese imperial system wasn't death. It was something called cold palace exile. This wasn't just being moved to a different room. It was being systematically erased from existence while still being forced to live. Women sent to the cold palace would have their bedroom stripped of all comfort, all colour, all warmth, and all human contact, then be left to exist in this sensory void for years or even decades. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looked like, because the reality was more brutal than any physical torture. A woman sentenced to cold palace exile would wake up one morning to find her beautiful silk bedding replaced with rough, grey cloth. Her ornate furniture would be removed and replaced with basic wooden pieces. Her mirrors would be taken away, her jewellery confiscated, her books burned. Within hours, her bedroom would be transformed from a place of beauty into a deliberately ugly, depressing cell. But the physical changes were just the beginning. The real punishment was the complete social isolation. Women in the cold palace were forbidden from speaking to anyone except during brief, formal interactions with guards. They couldn't receive visitors, couldn't send letters, couldn't participate in any harem activities. They became living ghosts, existing in the same space as other people, but cut off from all human connection. The Ottoman Empire had a similar system called the silent chambers. Turkish palace records describe women who were sentenced to these chambers for crimes as minor as laughing too loudly during a formal ceremony. The punishment involved being moved to specially designed rooms where the walls were covered with sound-absorbing materials, creating an environment of complete silence that would drive women to the edge of madness. The psychological impact was devastating. Modern research on sensory deprivation shows that prolonged isolation can cause hallucinations, paranoia, and severe depression. But the women of the Imperial Harem endured this for years, sometimes decades. Palace records from the Ming dynasty describe women who spent over 30 years in cold palace exile, emerging as broken shadows of their former selves. But here's what makes these punishments even more cruel. They were designed to be visible to other women. The cold palace wasn't hidden away in some remote corner of the harem. It was deliberately placed where other women would see the punished individuals every day. It served as a constant reminder of what could happen to anyone who stepped out of line. The most heartbreaking aspect was how these punishments affected the women's sense of identity. When you're stripped of all personal possessions, cut off from all relationships, and forced to exist in ugly, uncomfortable surroundings, you begin to lose touch with who you are. Palace records contain accounts of women who forgot their own names after years in cold palace exile, who could no longer remember their families or their lives before the harem. The Korean Joseon dynasty developed something called the Grey Period, where women would have their bedrooms gradually drained of colour and comfort over a period of months. This slow transformation was psychologically devastating, because it gave women time to anticipate their fate while being powerless to prevent it. Each day, they would wake up to find their environment slightly more depressing than the day before. But perhaps the most diabolical punishment was forced companionship. This involved placing women who had committed different offences in the same room, creating situations where they would inevitably conflict with each other. A woman guilty of stealing might be forced to share a room with someone who had been caught with forbidden books, creating tension and mutual resentment that would make their isolation even more complete. The Mughal court had a punishment called the mirror curse, where women would be forced to stare at their own reflection for hours each day while being reminded of their failures and shortcomings. The psychological impact of this forced self-confrontation was so severe that some women would blind themselves rather than continue the punishment. The most subtle but effective punishment was what historians call privilege erosion. Instead of dramatically changing a woman's circumstances, the authorities would gradually remove small comforts and privileges over time. A woman might lose her right to burn incense, then her access to certain foods, then her better bedding, then her writing materials. The slow degradation was psychologically more devastating than sudden punishment, because it created a constant state of anxiety about what would be taken away next. The Ottoman system included companion punishment, where women would be forced to watch their friends being tortured or humiliated. This created a form of psychological trauma that extended far beyond the primary victim. Women would be haunted by images of their friends suffering, creating lasting mental scars that served as effective deterrents to future violations. But here's what's remarkable about these stories. Even in the face of such cruel punishments, women found ways to resist and support each other. They developed secret methods of communication that allowed them to maintain contact with women in punishment. They created subtle ways of showing solidarity and support that couldn't be detected by authorities. The most touching example comes from the Qing dynasty, where women developed what they called the silent friendship. Women in cold palace exile would receive small gifts that appeared to come from nowhere. A flower placed on their windowsill, a piece of cloth left in their room, a small amount of better food mixed in with their usual rations. These gifts were coordinated by the other women in the harem, who risked their own safety to provide comfort to their suffering sisters. The long-term effects of these punishments were devastating. Palace records show that women who survived cold palace exile often never fully recovered. They suffered from what we would now recognise as post-traumatic stress disorder, showing symptoms of anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal long after their official punishment had ended. The most tragic cases were women who had been innocent of any wrongdoing, but were punished as part of political purges or power struggles. Palace archives contain heartbreaking letters from women who maintained their innocence for decades, while enduring punishments that would have broken hardened criminals. Yet these women also showed incredible resilience. Some found ways to maintain their sanity by creating internal worlds of memory and imagination. Others developed spiritual practices that helped them endure the isolation. Still others found purpose in small acts of kindness toward other prisoners, creating meaning even in the most meaningless circumstances. The punishment system also created its own form of resistance. Women would sometimes deliberately commit minor offences to join friends who had been sent to punishment areas, choosing solidarity over safety. Others would use their time in punishment to plan resistance activities or to develop skills that would help them survive future challenges. The most remarkable survival story comes from the late Ming dynasty, where a woman named Autumn Moon spent 15 years in cold palace exile, but used the time to mentally compose and memorize an entire collection of poetry. When she was finally released, she became one of the most celebrated poets of her generation, turning her punishment into a source of creative inspiration. The bedroom punishments of the Imperial Harem represent some of the most sophisticated forms of psychological torture ever devised. They were designed not just to punish specific individuals, but to create a climate of fear that would control the entire population by making punishment visible and prolonged. The authorities ensured that every woman in the harem would live in constant awareness of what could happen to her. But these stories also show us the incredible power of human resilience. Even in the most brutal circumstances, people find ways to maintain their humanity, to care for each other, and to create meaning from suffering. The women who survived these punishments didn't just endure, they found ways to resist, to support each other, and to maintain their dignity even in the face of systematic dehumanization. The legacy of these punishment systems extends far beyond the palace walls. They remind us that the most effective forms of control are often psychological rather than physical, and that the most important forms of resistance are often small acts of kindness and solidarity that preserve human connection in inhuman circumstances. Now, as brutal as these punishment systems were, they also inadvertently created something remarkable. They forced women to become incredibly resourceful and creative about finding ways to escape their circumstances. And speaking of escape, what I'm about to reveal about the ingenious escape attempts from the Imperial Harem will show you that even in the most secure prison in the world, human ingenuity and the desire for freedom can create the most extraordinary possibilities. Against all odds, some women found ways to escape, and their methods were nothing short of brilliant. The Imperial Harem was designed to be the most secure prison in the world. Walls 30 feet high, guards at every entrance, surveillance